Hey guys, today I'm filling one of your requests. Today we're taking a look at the Aowen watercolors that you guys asked me to take a look at. Hey there, art nerds. You guys voted for it. Today we're taking a look at the Aowen watercolors. These were purchased from AliExpress, and I'll have all the info you need down in the description below. So if I forget to mention something during this video, just make sure you check the description. I should have you covered. So these are made by the same company that manufactures Rubens and the Meiliang Pigments, and I'm really curious to see how these compare against those two today, because I already really like the Meiliang Pigments and I already kind of consider them Aowen's student grade watercolors. So I'm wondering where in the lineup this palette falls. I do like the bright and sunny yellow exterior. Usually from Rubens, we either see kind of a teal blue, a minty green, or a baby pink. So the yellow is a nice addition to their lineup, and I really appreciate that they utilize such cute and fun colors for art supplies, because I never understood why the exterior of art supply packaging always had to be so kind of boring and dour. This watercolor palette arrived from AliExpress pretty much the way it is now. I think it came wrapped with 3 other palettes and some bubble wrap, but there was no shrink wrap, there was no additional packaging, there was no box included. And it came kind of dinged up, which nobody really wants to see. There's not a lot going on here, just a barcode on the back that says Shanghai Own Art Materials Co. Limited. And then on the front, there's a little bit of embossing that says Aowen. Inside is much more promising. We have this watercolor paper booklet, and I think it's hard to tell. It's a little dirty actually, but I think, so these are watercolor postcards. I don't know why they're so dirty though. I've never opened this before. Like, look, there's already a smudge print here. And then there is also a swatch card here where everything has been labeled for us. And then there's a small informational booklet, O.Win Shanghai Aowen Art Materials Co. Limited. And what's kind of interesting is I actually have another O.Win palette to show you guys in another unboxing swatch. So inside, we've got some translating to do, which I'll do in a minute. O.Win solid watercolor pigment. We've got some very basic watercolor instructions. These look familiar. Another watercolor set sent me this. And then we know what this is. We've seen this from Rubens before. So I'm not going to translate this because I've translated this in other videos. And then this appears to be their color range with their color names and light fast information. Not necessarily seeing any pigment information at all though. So I'm going to go ahead and translate this. So our translation reads, Hui Aowen solid watercolor pigment, Win solid watercolor pigments. I think we're starting here. Colloidal selection. Select the Southern Sahara region, imported high quality gum Arabic, safe 9 poisons, no methyl and zui dilay. The solubility of each color powder has been tested many times, which can make the pigment in the use to archive the best bathwater effect. Selection of color powder. Aowen watercolor is made of high quality colorants that do not contain negotiation, auxiliary, complex, and mercury, and is ground with gum Arabic for many times. Good transparency, dissolves in water, and takes its state easily. Grinding and filling. Each color of O.Win watercolor paint has been researched many times to ensure the color can reach the best fineness. The pigment adopts multiple filling processes without adding any fillers, extrusion, molding, so that each filling can be dried with extremely high purity. The pigment is only produced with pure color powder with high purity, and no filler is added. Therefore, Meiliang watercolor paint is suitable for both dry and wet painting methods without graying and color changes. Whew, man, Google Translate had some difficulty with this one. So if you're watching and you can provide a better translation and you feel up to the task, if you're willing to do so, I would really appreciate it if you let me know down in the comments below, and I'll pin your translation. So Other than that, we have our card that has our star system and what that means. 3 stars is absolutely permanent, 2 stars is moderately durable, and 1 star is fugitive. And most of these colors are 3 stars, quite a few are 2 stars. I'm not seeing any 1 stars here. Of course, I am not going to do light fast testing. That's not really something I do here on the channel. So I encourage you, before you purchase these, watch a couple of other reviews. I'm a watercolor comic artist, so what I'm looking for with these watercolors is I'm looking for the price point. I'm looking for how vibrant the colors are, how well they mix, how well they go down wet into wet, how well they activate, how well they handle. I'm basically looking at the painting properties. But generally, when I'm finished with a watercolor illustration, I scan it, share it online, and it goes in a portfolio. So if you're interested in light fast information, I can help you, but only if you join me over on Patreon, because my big $500 goal is to do some massive light fast testing. So that could be something in the future cards. But as of right now, I'm going to test many, many things, but not light fast testing. And then here are our postcards. They sent us one already painted for us. And I'm gonna erase. I think I can get the dirt smudges to come off with an eraser, but I have no idea why they're so dirty. Well, I could not get the dirt smudges to come off, which is kind of concerning for a new product, but we're gonna go ahead and move on. So this is a 36 half pan set. These half pans are more square than I'm normally used to. These also look like they were poured. You guys can see, hopefully, from all the irregularities. At the top, we have some larger mixing surfaces. And then at the bottom, this is an unusual palette, and I look forward to kind of diving into it. But our half pans are shrink wrapped inside this. Seriously, I have never really seen a watercolor palette quite like this one, so I'm not sure what to make of it. And as part of today's review, I'm going to be comparing them against other Shanghai Aowen watercolors, namely the Paul Rubens half pans and the Meiliang Pigments, the pretty excellent pigments. So this is also a 36 half pan palette. Comes in an adorable mint green tin. It did not come with a swatch card, so I made my own, but it did come with a water brush. These were extruded little chiclets of paint in a fairly inexpensive plastic liner. That said, I really, really like this palette, and I felt like it really shone during the field test. I haven't had a chance to do a redemption field test for the Paul Rubens half pans just yet, but I do love the Paul Rubens tubins and have talked about them quite a bit here on the channel, and I hope to do a field test of the Paul Rubens watercolors soon. So this comes in an adorable pink palette, although this is not the only color they offer this in. You do have your choice. This is a 24 half pan palette. It did come with a watercolor paper swatch card, and inside are full-size half pans that I believe to be poured watercolors. So I'm going to be comparing these Aowen, which are made by the same company as the other two, against the regular Paul Rubens and the Meiliang Pigments. The QR codes on the back here try to open the WeChat app. I'm not interested in that life, but I do believe we have a no, we don't have a website. All right, well, I am just going to have to bring it up myself. When Googling Shanghai Aowen, instead it wants to correct it to Shanghai Haobin Stationery and Art Material Co. Limited. So the O.Win doesn't really bring up anything. The Haobin does. They are an art supply manufacturer, so it could be the same company. Everything kind of checks out. The port that they're operating out of checks out, but I am not seeing this particular watercolor palette on their website. Yeah, they do offer OEM services, which is kind of like when you can get them to manufacture products for you. We've talked about that in some of our other unbox and swatch videos, so I'm not going to go into that too much. I'm a little frustrated that I can't find this. I can't find this on AliExpress where I originally bought it, and I'm not finding it on their website. So maybe this was discontinued. I'm not super sure, but it's a little fresh. Actually, nope, that's not it either. Sorry, I got all excited because I saw a palette from Meiliang which looked a lot like this one, but in pink. But instead of these half pans, which is what kind of drew me to it, they're the same extruded chiclets. So unfortunately, it's the same palette we were looking at before. I'm just gonna have to keep digging while I'm working on recording this, and hopefully I can find this and I can talk about it, like talk about the price point and that sort of stuff before the end of the video. But that's kind of the downside of buying things from AliExpress and then, you know, having a backlog of products that I want to talk about, is sometimes things get pulled off the market pretty dang quick. I'm kind of impressed there was a minimal amount of waste with this. However, our poured half pans do seem a little bit dusty and dirty, so I'm going to try to clean them before we start. And these are actually square half pans. That's kind of unusual, actually. We're used to the rectangular ones, and the plastic's a little bit different too. So these are just a smidge different, and that's kind of cool from what we normally talk about here on the channel. But everything's a little bit dirty, and that makes me wonder if it's been sitting for a while before it shipped out or what. So I tried to do a little bit of digging to find this O.Win or Aowen company, and I couldn't really. I found some stuff on the Shanghai Aowen company that makes Meiliang and Paul Rubens. I believe somebody told me that these were made by the same company. There's definitely a reason I feel this way. Unfortunately, allergies have been kicking my butt up and down the block for the past 2 weeks, so I'm a little bit out of it, but I'm sure one of you guys will be generous and let me know down in the comments below. I am linking what I could find for the Shanghai Aowen in the show notes, but I'm not really going to go over that because we've talked about that almost every time we talk about Paul Rubens, and I don't really feel like we need to dedicate the space to that today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean these off. I'm just going to brush off the excess dirt. Then we are going to swatch them on their included swatch sheet, and then I'm going to swatch them on Blick Studio cotton rag watercolor paper. Once we finish with the swatching, we're going to move on to the wet into wet test. It's going to tell us how these pigments perform when you add a bunch of water. In a follow-up video, I'm going to put these to the field test where I'm going to use these, if they perform well today, to paint a watercolor illustration, and that plus what we talk about today is hopefully going to tell us most of what we need to know about whether or not these watercolors are a good fit for you. So before I go too much further, I just want to point out, okay, it says O.Win, and then down here it says Shanghai Aowen Art Materials Co. Limited. All right. Then on the back of the Paul Rubens, or somewhere on the Paul Rubens, it's going to say that. No, what? It must say it in the paperwork. Sorry, it's going to drive me crazy. Well, I know that Paul Rubens is made by Shanghai Aowen Art Materials Co. Limited. I just don't know why this yellow palette isn't anywhere on any of their stuff, but it isn't. The colors in this set are 150 white with 3 stars of light fastness, 346 lemon yellow with 2 stars, 109 cad yellow hue with 3 stars, 268 yellow orange with 2 stars, 090 cad orange, which is a hue, with 3 stars, 103 cad red light, which is a hue, with 3 stars, 686 vermilion with 3 stars, 601 scarlet lake with 2 stars, 205 crimson lake with 2 stars, 206 crimson lake deep with 2 stars, 003 alizarin crimson with 3 stars, 502 permanent rose with 2 stars, and that's the first row. The second row is 544 purple lake with 3 stars, 398 mauve with 3 stars, 231 dioxine violet with 2 stars, 679 verditer blue with 2 stars, 139 cerulean blue hue with 3 stars, 327 intense blue with 3 stars, 179 cobalt blue with 3 stars, 660 ultramarine with 3 stars, 654 turkey blue with 2 stars, 538 Prussian blue with 2 stars, 323 Payne's gray with 2 stars, 341 yellow green with 2 stars. And then the third row down at the bottom, 599 sap green with 2 stars, 314 Hooker's green light with 2 stars, 312 Hooker's green deep with 2 stars, 696 Viridian hue with 3 stars, 447 olive green with 2 stars, 744 yellow ochre with 3 stars, 552 raw sienna with 3 stars, 074 burnt sienna with 3 stars, 076 burnt umber with 3 stars, 676 Van Dyke brown with 2 stars, 609 sepia with 3 stars, 337 lamp black with 3 stars, and no pigment information was provided for this set. Their included swatch paper is really thin and prone to buckling, but the colors seem vibrant and they really remind me of the Meiliang Pigments palette. And I kind of wonder if the Meiliang Pigments palette is just a rebrand of O.Win, and that's why I was having so much trouble finding O.Win. The neutrals are a bit weak, very similar to the Meiliang Pigments. And I keep showing you guys my rinse water because that's a good idea of how many optical brighteners are in this set. The muddier the water, unless we're working with pastels, typically the more optical brighteners were included to make the colors in the half pan seem brighter, so to make the mass tones seem brighter and more appealing. And so far this is about on par with the Meiliang Pigment set. I finished swatching on their paper. This palette, this color palette, really reminds me of the Meiliang Pigments palette, to the point where I'm wondering if maybe the Meiliang Pigments palette, which is still available and easy to find, is just a rebrand of the O.Win palette. So it'd be interesting to compare the two, and while I can't decide that definitively, if any of you guys have the scoop on that, I would love to hear it. So you can reach out to me either in the comments or in the paint box. So next, we are going to swatch on our standard, the gold standard, our Blick Studio watercolor paper. This is a cotton rag watercolor paper, and I figure this is going to give us the fairest chance for these paints to really shine. So what I did is I went ahead and I drew some lines using a black Copic marker, so it should be waterproof, although sometimes something in the paints will interact with it and cause some discoloration. But this is mostly just helpful in determining opacity. So we're going to be looking at how quickly, how well these activate, which it seems like they already activate pretty well. We're looking for granulation. We're looking at the ability to wash them out or create a fade. We're looking at saturation, and if this swatch sheet is anything to go by, these are fairly saturated except for the neutral colors. Those start to get a little bit weak. We're also looking at opacity, and later, after everything's had a chance to dry and after we've done some color mixing, we're going to be testing liftability. So when swatching on my cotton rag paper, I'm looking for granulation, washout ability, saturation, opacity, and later on liftability. So I noticed that color saturation and granulation is pretty similar to what I already saw on their swatch paper. I was hoping for something a little more dramatic on this cold press cotton rag watercolor paper because there's a lot of nooks and crannies for pigments to fall into. Not so much. I really was hoping for more granulation, particularly from colors like ultramarine blue, any of the greens, yellow, ochre, and umber. A couple of the darker browns have a little bit of granulation. The more I handle these, the more I'm reminded of the Meiliang Pigments paints. Here's my rinse water for row 1. It almost looks like an orange Kool-Aid. There is some optical brighteners in this, so just kind of keep that in mind. Now, just because paints include some optical brighteners to make them a little bit more appealing or make them stand out on the paper, that's not the kiss of death for paints, and it's not necessarily an indication that paints are cheaper or that they don't perform as well. It's going to make layering potentially a little bit more muddy and possibly a little bit more limited. So that's one of the reasons I pointed out early. If you're someone who likes to do 1, maybe 2 layers and you really want those bright, vibrant colors from the get-go, this shouldn't be as big a problem as someone who's really building up a lot of color through delicate glazes and washes. So it really kind of depends on your painting style and what you're hoping to get out of the paints. So the color saturation and granulation is pretty similar to what I saw on their swatch paper. I was hoping for more granulation, particularly from colors like ultramarine blue or any of the greens, the yellow ochre or the umber. A couple of the darker browns do have a little bit more granulation. The more I handle these, the more I'm reminded of the Meiliang Pigments paint. So that's definitely something we're gonna have to dive into later on. So next we're gonna do some color mixing. Same as with my other student grade Showdown videos, we're going to do both optical mixing where we layer one color on top of the other, as well as atomic mixing where we mix 2 colors to make a secondary color. And we're really just going to focus on mixing the primaries here. And then if I still have some room, we'll mix some interesting secondary popular mixes like Payne's Gray. I'm going to start by laying down the first layer for my optical blending grid first. So we've got a cool yellow, a warm yellow, a cool red, a warm red, a cool blue, a warm blue, same as we always do, pinky. And this is developing secondary colors by using layering. This can be really important for watercolor. We're also going to do atomic mixing where we take 2 colors and we smash them together to get a secondary color. So generally I like to do the cool yellows, the warm yellows, the cool reds, the warm reds, the cool blues, the warm blues, and mix them all together so we have a bunch of different color mixes, and this gives me a really good idea of how clean our mixes are and whether or not I need to look out for muddiness. Now everything mixed cleanly for the most part, although some of the mixes were a little bit muddy. This set can probably do 2 color mixes quite well, but it might struggle with 3 color mixes. I'm also going to mix a Payne's Gray, mostly because that's just kind of a good test to see how well it can mix a Payne's Gray. Another good test is the purples. If I can mix some clean, vibrant purples, then this is probably a set that works well for color mixing. So our color mixes, it mixes pretty cleanly for the most part. There's some concerning muddiness though, just a little bit. I feel like these probably do 2 color mixes well, but struggle with 3. As for our optical mixing, there was a little bit of reactivation. I probably just didn't give it enough time to dry. We are in Southeast Louisiana after all, and it's pretty humid down here, so that could have been a factor. It was dry to the touch, but there might have been some surface moisture in there that when I layered my second layer on top of it, it reactivated it, but you can actually see delineation between two colors when two different colors cross over each other, which is one of the things I'm looking for when I'm looking at color mixing. Next, we're going to do the lift test. So what I'm looking for here is different degrees of liftability, because different pigments have different properties. Some are going to be more staining, some are going to be more prone to lifting. If everything lifts uniformly, whether it doesn't lift at all, or it lifts a little, or it lifts completely, that's generally not a great sign. That's usually a warning sign. In terms of lifting, everything is pretty similar. That's not really a great sign. You do want to see varying degrees of staining and granulation as well as liftability, because different pigments are going to have different properties. They're not all going to adhere to the paper the same amount. However, that said, these don't look like dye-based watercolors the way many of the other cheap sets do. These do look like they are actual pigments. They may have gone with some cheaper pigments since this is a student grade set. Unfortunately, everything's kind of similar in terms of liftability, which is not a great sign. So I have one more test for today. We're going to do the wet into wet test on a smaller pad of the Blick Studio cotton rag paper. This test is pretty straightforward, but it's going to tell us a lot about how these paints will handle in kind of a more realistic painting situation. And this was inspired by getting burnt by those Meiliang watercolors a while back. So what I'm going to do is I am just going to saturate the paper with water, then dump a bunch of pigments on it, let it dry, and see what the paper has to say. So for this wet into wet test, I have to say I was really impressed. The colors go down really vibrant and fun. They blend out into the water easily and readily, and they blend into other colors easily and readily. And it seems like there might be some much needed granulation when we have this much water and we allow them to dry. I was tempted to leave it as just a pretty rainbow. That'd make a nice scan that I could share with my patrons, but doing the little drip dots tells me a lot about potential optical brighteners, so I did do some drips of various colors, both semi-opaque, opaque, and semi-transparent. When they dried, I'm going to look at them and see if they leave any halos or if they diffused cleanly into the surrounding paint. But you guys can see how much color these bring, especially if you watch some of my other student grade Showdown videos like the Xylee W, for example, or the See Me art, where there's just no color impact at all. You have to really scrub to get any color. With the Owen as well as with the Meiliang Pigments palettes, you don't really have to do a lot of scrubbing. The colors activate very quickly and very readily, and you have a lot of color at your disposal. So if you're a color fanatic, this could be a good palette for you. So I'm going to allow it to dry in hyperlapse so we can see how much the colors lighten. And I was really impressed that when they dried, the colors dried vibrant. There might be a little bit of optical brighteners, but not enough to ruin the palette for me. The two colors that are suspect are easily avoided in wet into wet situations. Okay, so it's like that really light opaque green, so the one all the way over to the side, and vetiver blue, and those are just known for having some PW6 in them to make them stand out a little bit more. So compared against the Paul Rubens and Meiliang pigment sets. So one thing I want to point out is that these are actually little half pans. They're square half pans. They seem like they hold about as much paint as your standard half pan. So that makes this palette much more reusable. You can reuse these half pans once you've finished out with the paint that's already in them. It's a standard size, so you could put your own half pans in or whole pans if you want to. And the palette itself is a little bit larger than the Meiliang Pigments palette, but that means you have room for a brush. Now, it does have a larger desk footprint, and that can cause some frustration. So if you have been watching the channel, you guys know I just did Art Supply Redemption with this Paul Rubens palette. And the Paul Rubens palette is their more professional, their more premium lineup where we have easier access to their pigment information. But as you guys can see, the half pans from the Owen set are pretty similar in amount, pretty similar in volume to the Paul Rubens set, whereas the Meiliang Pigment set is already, this is the 36 half pan palette. It's already much smaller than the same 36 half pan Owen palette. To be honest, I think these are the same thing. I think Owen might have rebranded into Meiliang Pigments. If you guys know, please let me know down in the comments. So the Meiliang Pigments, the Pretty Excellent Parrot pigments, didn't come with a swatch card the way the O.Win did, and that's kind of a loss there. And the paints themselves are extruded paints rather than poured paints. The O.Win set looks like it might be poured paints. Extruded paints are, I just don't like them as much. I find they don't reactivate as quickly or as easily as poured paints. They're a little bit drier, but that might just be personal preference on my part. I also think we're getting a little bit less paint with the Meiliang Pigments paint. So for the Meiliang Pigments, I paid $45 for that set because I purchased it over at David's Art Center. So I paid a little bit more because I bought it from my local brick and mortar. You can find it in the $30-ish price range on Amazon. Whereas the Owen set, I did find the listing for it. That's going to be down in the description below. That I paid $30 for this palette. So these are getting really close in price to the $45 Paul Rubens palette. As you guys can see from the color swatches as well as from the pans themselves, the color selection in both of these sets is, if not identical, extremely close. They might have subbed out a couple of colors. Maybe they found some cheaper pigments that they wanted to use or something that worked better or a color that was more popular, but they have very similar price range. So the O.Win paints are poured rather than extruded, so that makes them a little bit more similar to the Paul Rubens half pans than to the Meiliang Pigment half pans. They're also square half pans, and that's kind of the first time I've seen square half pans, whereas the extruded paints in the Meiliang set are in this like plastic liner thing that I don't want to remove because it's actually kind of flimsy. And the Meiliang Pigment half pans are a little bit on the smaller size. They're not really a full half pan, whereas the O.Win half pans, even though they're a little bit of an unusual size, they are a standard half pan amount of paint, and you can even use regular half pans in this palette if you wanted to go ahead and start adding in Paul Rubens or your other favorite watercolors to this set as you kind of outgrow some of these colors. That's not really something that you can easily do with the Meiliang Pigment set, which kind of limits its lifetime usability. That said, it came with a water brush. The Owen set that I received didn't even come with the box that it's supposed to come with, which is a little concerning. I might be missing other things. But it does come in bright, pretty colors. The Owen sets come in yellow, pink, and blue, and the Meiliang sets come in pink and this kind of pretty mint-ish color. So to me, the O.Win palette is more reusable since the paints come in pans. The pans can be cleaned out and refilled. The palette itself can hold half pans. The lid doesn't really snap closed securely, so you're going to want to hold it shut with a rubber band or maybe some washi tape during travel. Whereas the Meiliang Pigments, it came in the box and I still have the box, so if I want to hold it shut, I can just put it right back into the box. Now, I had a lot of trouble finding the listing for the O.Win palette. I'm not really sure why. The night I wanted to find it, I couldn't find it for the life of me. And it wasn't until I was working on the See Me Art review that I was finally able to find the listing for the O.Win palette. So that'll be down in the description below for you guys. It does show a box. The packaging seems really nice, but mine didn't come with any of that. So I guess it's a little bit of a I was going to say it's hard to recommend it if I don't have a listing, but I guess that's a non-issue because I do have a listing for you guys. So if you are interested in the Meiliang Pigments, this is such a your mileage may vary sort of situation. Really, the Meiliang Pigments are much more accessible, but I really did like the O.Win paints, and I find them to be comparable with the Meiliang Pigments paints with a slightly more usable palette. So, you know, I'll let you guys decide. I try to provide you guys with as much information as possible so that you guys can make an informed decision when you're buying art supplies. That's one of my big goals here on the channel, is that I want to help you guys buy art supplies that are going to make you happy, that are going to allow you to make the kind of art that you want to make. So what are the pros and cons of the yellow O.Win 36 half pan watercolor palette? The pros. The palette is a really cute color, and if you watch the channel, you know I am a sucker for cute and functional art supplies. It's really nice to see a little bit more vibrancy and a little bit more diversity in the art supply market. And the palette these paints come in is very reusable. You can refill the half pans with your paint of choice, or you can use your own half pans. Otherwise, to me, the set is very comparable with the Meiliang Pigments set. So in terms of one over the other, the Meiliang Pigments is a little bit more accessible. You can find it very easily on Amazon. You can find it on AliExpress. I found it at my local brick and mortar. I've never seen the O.Win set. I do kind of think that the O.Win set is perhaps rebranded as the Meiliang Pigments, and availability for this particular set might be limited, just based on my inability to find the listing a second time. But if you guys actually know what's going on with that, please let me know down in the comments. It gets a little bit confusing when things disappear and reappear and the website doesn't mention it and the website doesn't have any listing and no one else is carrying it. So the cons for this set is it can be difficult to find. So if you really want this set, you might have to look hard for it. The link I'm going to share in the description might not even be good by the time you decide you want to buy it. And I haven't really seen it carried elsewhere. And I haven't seen it on the Shanghai Aowen site either. So it might not be readily available, which admittedly might put this review into the just for fun or watch for company category, depending on whether or not you can find this palette. But honestly, both of them are good palettes. This palette has a couple of things over the Meiliang Pigments palette, but it also takes up way more desk space than the Meiliang Pigments palette. So if you have limited space, the Meiliang palette might be a better choice for you. But if you're looking for a watercolor palette, a student grade watercolor palette that's going to grow with you, that you can easily refill, that you can put your half and whole pans in, which is my preference when I'm reviewing student grade watercolors. I want to see palettes that are going to kind of grow with you. Then I think this one is a little bit better than the Meiliang Pigments, if only for that. I'm also going to take a second to point out that I lost a lot of the original audio for this. So if my hands are moving and they don't match the audio, now you know why. What's my verdict for the yellow Aowen palette? It can be a little bit challenging to find, so it's harder to recommend it because I'm not sure if it's even available. However, I still really like the Meiliang Pigment set, which is available. So if you like most of what you saw during this review with a few minor differences, mainly the palette size and the half pan size, I recommend you watch my Meiliang Pigments field test to see if that palette is a good fit for your needs. Now, this isn't it for Paul Rubens or Aowen. I have another O.Win palette that I'm going to review that I'd purchased from AliExpress. This red palette here, and it seems like you guys are just as interested in seeing what's in this palette as I am with showing it to you guys. And these are supposedly watercolor cakes, so it's going to be fun to compare this palette against the yellow palette that we just finished reviewing. So hopefully you guys will click subscribe and click that bell notification so YouTube will let you know when this video is live, because I'm really looking forward to unboxing and swatching it with you guys sometime in the near future. So what did you guys think about the Aowen palette? I actually found a listing for it. It was about $30, and I'm going to link that down in the show notes below. I don't know why. I really combed through AliExpress at the time I was reviewing this, and then when I was working on the Art watercolor 3 weeks later, I found a listing for this palette. So I don't know, AliExpress is weird sometimes. Maybe somebody relisted it. It is supposed to come with a box. It is supposed to be presented a lot better than dinged up and scratched up, which is what I received. So while I think my review is valid, I think your experiences might be better than my own. However, when I read the reviews on that listing, it mentioned that it came without the box that the photo shows. So maybe your experiences will be just like mine. So what do you guys think of this palette? Would you rather this palette or the Meiliang Pigments palette? Now, this palette comes in yellow, pink, and blue, and the Meiliang Pigments palette, which I think it's the same thing, just rebranded, just a little bit different, comes in teal, pink, and blue, I believe. So it's really more a matter of size, how much desk real estate it takes up, whether or not you want individual half pans, or if you don't mind having your paints in like an extruded plastic sleeve thing, and I guess the color of the palette. But I was actually fairly impressed by these. I would have been really impressed if I hadn't reviewed the Meiliang Pigments palette a while back and feel like these are kind of the same thing, because as I've mentioned here before, I don't really like reviewing repetitions of the same thing. That gets kind of boring. Good, bad, or indifferent, I want to see something unusual. So these are our swatches, fairly bright and vibrant. Not a lot of granulation, which is a little disappointing to see, but we were able to get some really nice color mixes. However, the wet into wet test actually does reveal some color granulation when you throw enough water at it. It also reveals a little bit of optical brighteners, but when we're talking about student grade watercolors, that's really not unusual. So I would give these a passing grade, but I don't know that I would pay $30 for them. That said, I did pay $45 for the Meiliang Pigments because I bought them at David's. So, you know, what I would recommend, I guess, if you're really interested in these and you don't mind waiting, is, you know, shop around for the best price and compare them against the Meiliang Pigments. The pros on this palette are that they come in half pans. Let me grab one for you guys. Rather than like a plastic sleeve that has our little paint chiclets in it. And I think these are poured paints rather than dried extruded paint. So to me, the reusability of this palette is much higher than the Meiliang Pigments. So if you're looking for a palette that can kind of grow as you grow, I think this is a better option for you. It's just designed for that a little bit better. But the price point is like right up there with Paul Rubens. So it comes into the same question I had with the Paul Rubens Art Supply Redemption is it worth the additional price? Should you just go ahead and get the Paul Rubens because they're not really that much more expensive? It's really up to you. This is going to be a your mileage may vary sort of situation, and what you want from watercolors and what you see yourself doing with them, because even with really good student grade watercolors, there are limitations that good professional grade watercolors don't necessarily have. So to me, it's really a your mileage may vary situation, but I hope that what we talked about today will help you guys make your decision. While I like these, I don't think I'm going to field test them specifically because they are so similar to the Meiliang Pigments. I feel like you could just watch the Meiliang video and get a good idea for how these are going to handle. I'm going to hang on to these though so that my students can use them, because I'm teaching more in-person watercolor classes, and it is nice to have some good student grade sets with lots of colors that they can actually play around with. So I'm not going to just, you know, donate this. I'm going to hold on to this set because it is going to get some use, but I don't think I'm going to do a field test just because they're so similar to the Meiliang Pigment. So I'm going to link everything we talked about today. I'm going to link Paul Rubens, I'm going to link the Meiliang reviews, I'm going to link all of that in the description below and in the cards. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I hope this review was helpful, useful, and informative as always. I hope it answered some of your questions, and I hope it's going to help you guys make a decision in buying the art supplies that are right for you, because I sincerely feel like while there is a saying that it is a poor artist who blames his tools, I can sincerely say from my own experience and from my experiences as a teacher that poor art supplies can turn somebody off on a media that they might otherwise love. So it's really important to me to help you guys find art supplies that are right for your budget, right for your art style, and right for you. And hopefully today's review did just that. If you enjoyed this video, it would really mean a lot to me if you click the thumbs up and maybe left a comment, maybe recommend another watercolor set you'd like to see me review, either on AliExpress or Amazon, something I haven't reviewed yet. I am always on the lookout for new and interesting stuff, and I really rely on you guys to help point me in the right direction, because even though I'm always on like Blick and Jerry's and Amazon and AliExpress, I'm always looking for new things, I miss stuff all the time. And if you live in a different country than me, you might have access to, or you might know about stuff that I haven't had a chance to check out yet. So please recommend some stuff for me to review, good, bad, or whatever. Let me know what you want to see me talk about, whether it's because you're curious about it or you want to see how I would feel about it. Let me know down in the comments below. And if you are new here, hi, welcome. I update twice a week with tutorials and art supply reviews. I am a watercolor comic artist. I paint the watercolor comics 7-inch Kara. You guys can check it out at 7inchkara.com. Let me know what you think. I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys. And a lot of how I approach watercolor comes from that watercolor comics and watercolor illustration background. I'm not a fine art watercolorist. I'm not an abstract watercolorist. I paint a lot of people, and I paint a lot of environments, and I paint a lot. So I'm always on the lookout for paints that have interesting effects, paints that are fairly economical, and paints that'll really hold up to what I want to put them through. So that's the lens that I see the watercolor world through. And if you also see the world through that lens, or you're interested, or you just like my art, then you are in the right place. So it'd really mean a lot to me if you click the subscribe button and click the bell notification so that YouTube lets you know when I update. I also share my updates over on my Patreon once a week on the public, so anybody can see it. I do a big old recap, and I usually do a blog post where I talk about different art subjects. You can check that out at patreon.com/natosoup. And if you want to help me continue to do what I'm doing, because as you guys might have noticed, we don't have any sponsors here. I guess my comic is the sponsor. I guess I could say that. 7-inch Kara is the sponsor of this video. But my patrons are the reason I am able to do these reviews. I use the funds raised from Patreon to turn around and buy more art supplies to review, as well as the myriad of consumables that comes from reviewing art supplies. So if you want to help me do what I do, you can join me for just $2 a month over on Patreon, and you can get early access to videos like this. You can get backer exclusive to my class materials that I don't share publicly, like presentations, handouts, printables, that sort of thing. And you're helping me create more art educational content. And a huge thanks to my amazing patrons for doing just that and for all their support. You guys will see their names right now.